let's talk about the components of the environmental process. Note that these don't necessarily go in a strict order. Sometimes they overlap or they can even circle back around again. But in general, you normally start with a phase 1 environmental site assessment. It's basically a research report put together by an environmental professional that looks at what was at the site previously, what's there now, and what are the environmental concerns with the present and past uses. We're going to talk about this more in a minute as it relates to the liability protections. A phase 2 environmental site assessment is where your environmental consultant will take soil and groundwater samples at a site, analyze them for contamination, and then compare those results to state standards to see if there are any issues that need to be cleaned up. If there is contamination above regulatory standards, then your environmental consultant will develop a cleanup plan to address that contamination. And then finally, the cleanup plan is implemented to remediate the environmental issues at a site. So cleanup for our purposes is addressing the environmental issues at a site to reduce the risk of exposure to people and the environment based on the state's regulatory process. So cleanup can include removing and treating the contamination, or using engineering controls like parking lots to cap the contamination, or employing institutional controls like conveyance notices to prevent exposure. Engineering and institutional controls are options under the LDEQ's voluntary remediation program, and we're going to talk about that more in part 2 of this series. Note, I separated out cleanup planning from executing the cleanup plan, as those fall under different pots of EPA brownfield funding. And one note about conducting environmental assessments and cleanup work at historic properties. If you're looking at applying for historic tax credits, or the site is located in a historic district, you'll want to keep the State Historic Preservation Office and or the local historic commission in the loop. Normally, the assessment work doesn't really impact the historic integrity of the building, and they don't really have any issues with assessment work, but people or neighbors might call the SHPO or the local historic commission if they see people working at a site. So it's always a good idea to give them a heads up so they're not caught off guard. The cleanup, especially things like asbestos abatement, can impact the structure of the site or involve removing materials from the site. So you just want to make sure that the SHPO is on board with any removal or demolition work that's related to the cleanup. So 2 of the projects I worked on, the Lindy Boggs Medical Center and the Rose Collaborative site, both are historic properties. With the Lindy Boggs Medical Center, the SHPO needed to approve the asbestos abatement activities involved because they involved removing asbestos-containing materials from the site, such as fireproof countertops and fire doors. So the developer sent SHPO the cleanup plan along with their demolition redevelopment plan, so they were in the loop regarding the asbestos abatement. For the Rose Collaborative site, which redeveloped the former St. Rose de Lima Church and school buildings, when we were doing the assessment work, I just gave the SHPO a call before we started, especially because we were going to remove an underground storage tank from the site, just in case someone called them to make sure they were in the loop and not caught off guard. Like I said, normally the environmental work doesn't cause a concern, but it's good to just give them a heads up just in case. As I mentioned before, the Brownfield program created the category of bona fide prospective purchaser. So basically someone who documents what the environmental conditions are at the site before they take ownership to show that they didn't cause or are otherwise responsible for pre-existing contamination. This gives the bona fide prospective purchaser, including any potential funders, liability protection at the state and federal level, and allows them to be eligible for brownfield cleanup funding if they choose to pursue that. So in order to qualify as a bona fide prospective purchaser, you need to perform what EPA refers to as all appropriate inquiries before taking ownership of a property to document what was there before you owned it. So as I mentioned before, basically it's a research report where the environmental professional is going to look at government records, historic data resources, like aerial photos, fire insurance maps. They'll interview folks that might know something about the history of the site, And they'll also do a site visit to look for signs of potential environmental issues. Then they put together a report that documents what was at the site in the past, what's there now, and what are the recognized environmental conditions, they're commonly called RECs, related to those uses. Most people meet this requirement by performing a Phase 1 environmental site assessment that meets ASTM standard E1527-13. ASTM is an international organization that develops industry standards and how-to guides to meet federal regulations. The E1527 standard is the one that's specific for Phase 1 assessments. It was last updated in 2013, which is where the 13 comes from. It's probably going to be updated again next year, so just be aware of that. So when you're contracting with an environmental professional to do a Phase 1, you want to ask them for one that complies with EPA's all appropriate inquiries and the most current version of ASTM E1527. All right, a few notes on things you should keep in mind regarding all appropriate inquiries and Phase 1 assessments. You do want to make sure your Phase 1 is conducted or overseen by someone that meets the EPA definition of an environmental professional based on their education and or experience. And that link at the bottom will give you more information with what those specifications are. Secondly, everyone who wants to be covered by the liability protection of the Phase 1, they need to be identified as a user in a report. That's a specific term, and there's a section in the report that identifies the user. And they also need to be included in the interview section, where they basically provide whatever information they have on the history of the site. If they don't know anything, they just need to say, I don't know anything about the history of the site. So this includes the prospective purchaser, and we're also seeing that most folks that provide funding to a project also want to be included. Just let your environmental professional know who all the users are up front so they can be included. You can add them later on. They can do like an addendum letter, but that's normally an additional charge and just a general hassle. All right, now for one of my pet peeves. I don't really agree with this language, but EPA's all appropriate inquiries requires the use of this specific statement. This assessment has revealed no evidence of recognized environmental conditions in connection with the property except for the following, and then there's a bulleted list of what your environmental conditions are. Please do not stop reading at no evidence. I've had a lot of people tell me they did a Phase 1 and it came back clean, but when they actually send it over to me, because normally there's a red flag like it used to be a gas station or something else where I'm thinking there's no way that it came back clean. There's actually a long list of environmental issues, but they stopped reading when it said this assessment has revealed no evidence. So please keep reading. It doesn't really matter for liability protection, but it does make a difference when you want to redevelop the site and then are surprised by the environmental issues that came up that were underneath that list, but folks stop reading at the no evidence. Finally, the timing of the Phase 1 is important, and we're going to cover that on the next slide. So in order to be valid for liability protection, the Phase 1 needs to be completed prior to taking ownership of a site. So you're documenting what was there before you took ownership, or in the case of a funder, provided funding to the project. The Phase 1 report is only valid for 1 year, after which you need a new report. And certain parts of the Phase 1 report, like the interviews, the review of government records, the site visit, and searches for environmental cleanup liens, those need to be updated after 180 days. So if you did the Phase 1, let's say in April, but you don't complete the property transaction until December, make sure to update that Phase 1 so it's still valid. It's not unusual to do multiple Phase 1s over the course of a project. For example, one of the sites I worked on, we did a Phase 1 at the beginning of a project for liability protection for a prospective tenant and to figure out what the environmental concerns were so we could develop the sampling plan for the Phase 2. We did another phase one prior to the developer taking actual ownership of the site because more than a year had passed since the original phase one. This also made them eligible for cleanup funding to address the lead, asbestos, and avian fecal matter at the site. And later we did a phase one update to cover the liability concerns for a funder who was contributing to financing to the project because more than 180 days had passed since the previous phase one. Sometimes you need to do these several times over the course of the project. Note that for EPA funding eligibility, EPA uses the date of the report in order to calculate their timeline. They require that if you're requesting cleanup funding, that you have performed a phase one before taking ownership of the site, and they're going to use the date of that report to calculate the timeline. However, for liability protection, some courts have ruled that the clock starts ticking at the start of the investigation. So, for example, when records are requested or a site visit is conducted. Basically, people were holding off completing the reports for several months. I think one of them was over a year in order to coincide with the property transfer deadlines, and the courts decided that didn't really comply with the intention of the law. It's kind of up to you to decide which one you are most comfortable with. Again, there's a link at the bottom of the slide which will give you additional information on EPA's all appropriate inquiries requirements. So that's a general overview of the Brownfields program and the environmental process. As I mentioned before, in part 2, we'll go over how to access brownfield resources to help you assess and clean up brownfield sites to facilitate their reuse, and how to collaborate with your local brownfields program. If you have any questions or would like more information on anything I covered, please feel free to contact me. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to working with you in the future.